Hi, I'm Dale Wells. Welcome to Lesson 9 in our 13-lesson study of Moses, Face to Face with God. Today we're talking about Numbers 14, verses 1 to 25, Rebellion, Trusting God Against All Odds. The Heritage Bible Masterclass is a non-denominational group of senior adults who love the Lord and His Word. We meet at the Heritage Palms Country Club, south of Fred Waring, east of Jefferson Street in Indio, California, every Sunday morning at 10:15. We'd love to have you join us. Just let them know at the gate that you're there for the Bible study, and the guard will let you right in. Feel free to comment as you watch this video or any other videos, and if you find them helpful, help me out by hitting the like button. If you'll subscribe to the channel, you'll be notified whenever I post new material. Today our text is Numbers 14, verses 1 to 25. Let's listen to it together.
Chapter 14. That night, all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, "If only we had died in Egypt, or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us to this land, only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and children will be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt?" And they said to each other, "We should choose a leader and go back to Egypt." Then Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole Israelite assembly gathered there. Joshua son of Nun and Caleb son of Jephunneh, who were among those who had explored the land, tore their clothes and said to the entire Israelite assembly, "The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. If the Lord is pleased with us, He will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them." But the whole assembly talked about stoning them. Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting to all the Israelites. The Lord said to Moses, "How long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me, in spite of all the signs I have performed among them? I will strike them down with a plague and destroy them. But I will make you into a nation greater and stronger than they." Moses said to the Lord, "Then the Egyptians will hear about it. By your power you brought these people up from among them, and they will tell the inhabitants of this land about it. They have already heard that you, Lord, are with these people, and that you, Lord, have been seen face to face, that your cloud stays over them, and that you go before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. If you put all these people to death, leaving none alive, the nations who have heard this report about you will say, 'The Lord was not able to bring these people into the land He promised them on oath, so He slaughtered them in the wilderness.' Now may the Lord's strength be displayed, just as you have declared. The Lord is slow to anger, abounding in love, and forgiving sin and rebellion. Yet He does not leave the guilty unpunished. He punishes the children for the sin of the parents to the third and fourth generation. In accordance with your great love, forgive the sin of these people, just as you have pardoned them from the time they left Egypt until now." The Lord replied, "I have forgiven them as you asked. Nevertheless, as surely as I live, and as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the whole earth, not one of those who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their ancestors. No one who has treated me with contempt will ever see it. But because my servant Caleb has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the land he went to, and his descendants will inherit it. Since the Amalekites and the Canaanites are living in the valleys, turn back tomorrow and set out toward the desert along the route to the Red Sea."
As is our custom, I've come up with 10 questions to contemplate as you look at the text. What complaints did the Israelites make against Moses and Aaron? Well, the Israelites' complaints against Moses and Aaron represent a comprehensive rejection of divine leadership and deliverance, revealing how fear can transform gratitude into blame and faith into rebellion. The text records their emotional response. That night, all the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. When it says all the congregation lifted up and gave their voice, that's the literal translation, that indicates a coordinated community expression of despair that goes beyond individual disappointment to encompass collective rebellion. Their specific accusations reveal the depth of their ingratitude and their spiritual blindness. First, they blame Moses and Aaron for bringing them to die in the wilderness. If only we had died in Egypt or in this wilderness. The phrase, if only we had died, uses an expression of vehement wishing that indicates that they would prefer death over trusting God's promises. This complaint ignores their previous slavery and the fact that God had delivered them from it, demonstrating how fear distorts memory and perspective. Second, they accuse their leaders of deliberately leading them into a military trap. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land only to let us fall by the sword, our wives and children be taken as plunder? When they say, why is the Lord bringing us, that reveals their theological confusion. They blame God for their circumstances while simultaneously questioning God's divine wisdom and goodness. The concern for their wives and children being taken as plunder shows a legitimate parental concern, but it's corrupted by a lack of faith in God's divine protection. Third, they completely reject the promised land and the divine covenant. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? This represents the ultimate spiritual regression, preferring their known bondage of the past to their uncertain freedom of the future. Familiar oppression to promised blessing. The statement, it's better for us to return to Egypt, demonstrates how thoroughly fear had corrupted their understanding of divine goodness and covenant blessing. This complaint reveals several psychological and spiritual dynamics. First, there's the fear of the Canaanites' military strength that overshadows their faith in God's power in spite of the previous miracles, the 10 plagues, the crossing of the Red Sea, the destruction of the Egyptian army in the Red Sea, all the ongoing divine provision in the wilderness. Second, their selective memory preserves only the pleasant aspects of Egyptian life while forgetting the brutality of slavery. And their present uncertainty seemed worse than past oppression, revealing their inability to live by faith rather than sight. Historically, this rebellion occurred about 2 years after the Exodus from Egypt, when Israel is positioned at Kadesh Barnea on the southern border of Canaan, ready to enter the Promised Land. The timing makes their rebellion even more tragic. They had experienced consistent divine faithfulness, and yet they responded to this first major challenge with a complete loss of faith. As Tim Ashley says in his New International Commentary on the Old Testament, fear transforms grateful hearts into complaining voices when present uncertainties seem more threatening than past deliverances, revealing how quickly human memory can forget divine faithfulness and choose familiar bondage over promised freedom. What did the Israelite mob propose to do? Well, the Israelite mob proposed what amounted to a complete rejection of their divine calling and covenant relationship by suggesting we should choose a leader and go back to Egypt. When they say, let's appoint a head and return to Egypt, that reveals both the political and spiritual dimension of their rebellion. Let us appoint a leader indicates their deliberate action. It's not an emotional outburst. They want to replace God's leadership in Moses with someone who would implement their desire to return to bondage. This proposal represents several levels of rebellion against divine authority. First, it constitutes political insurrection against God's appointed leadership. Moses had not chosen himself. He didn't even want to go back to Egypt. He'd been called by God at the burning bush, and he'd been repeatedly validated through miraculous signs. Replacing him meant rejecting the divine choice in favor of human preference. Second, it represents geographical rebellion against God's guidance toward the promised land in favor of return to the land of oppression. Third, the proposal embodies theological rebellion against God's covenant promises and purposes. The exodus from Egypt was not merely political liberation. It was covenant redemption designed to bring Israel into a relationship with God at Sinai and into possession of the promised inheritance, the promised land. Returning to Egypt would abandon the covenant benefits and responsibilities in favor of familiar servitude. And fourth, it demonstrates social rebellion as the popular will prevails over God's command. The historical context makes their proposal even more shocking. Egypt had just experienced devastating plagues that demonstrated God's power over the Egyptian gods and the Egyptian political structures. Pharaoh had released Israel only after the death of the Egyptian firstborn. The Egyptian army had been destroyed in the Red Sea. To return to Egypt would mean seeking refuge with their former oppressors who had every reason to be hostile to them. The logistics of their proposal reveals its impracticality as well as its spiritual bankruptcy. Going back to Egypt would require traversing the same wilderness that had intimidated them, but this time without God's divine guidance and protection, because they're rejecting that. They would arrive as former slaves whose departure had brought catastrophic judgment upon Egypt, making their reception highly uncertain. The Egyptian economic and political systems they remembered had been so severely damaged by the plagues that the so-called security they sought might no longer exist. The psychological dynamics behind their proposal reflect the human tendency to idealize the past when facing uncertain futures. Their selective memory preserved only the food security and predictable routine of Egyptian slavery, while forgetting the brutality, the oppression, and the hopelessness that had characterized their previous existence. The fear of the unknown challenges seemed preferable to trusting divine promises. And the proposal also reveals the mob mentality that can overcome individual judgment during times of stress and uncertainty. The unanimous nature of their rebellion, all the members of the community rebelled, suggests that fear and discouragement had spread throughout the camp, creating a groupthink that reinforced poor decision-making rather than encouraging faithful trust in divine endurance. The mob's proposal to return to Egypt represents the ultimate spiritual regression, where fear of uncertain divine promises drives people to prefer familiar bondage over the risks inherent in trusting God for an unknown but blessed future. When grumbling flared into outright rebellion, Moses and Aaron fell prostrate before the entire assembly. What emotions do you think they were feeling? The text says, Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole Israelite assembly gathered there. Their prostrate response to the rebellion involved a complex mixture of grief, intercession, horror, and spiritual desperation as they witnessed their people's complete rejection of God's promises and provision. The emotional component likely included profound grief over Israel's spiritual condition and ingratitude. Moses and Aaron had witnessed consistent divine faithfulness throughout the Exodus and wilderness journey, making Israel's rejection of divine promises personally heartbreaking. Intercessory prayer likely motivated their posture, as both men had previously interceded for Israel during times of divine judgment. Horror at the spiritual implications of Israel's rebellion would have created an emotional devastation for the leaders who understood covenant theology. Spiritual desperation may have driven their prostrate response, as they realized the gravity of divine judgment that their rebellion would provoke. By falling prostrate before the entire assembly, they visually communicated their rejection of the mob's proposal and their continued commitment to divine leadership and covenant promises. The emotional intensity of the moment is emphasized by its timing. This occurs immediately after the people's proposal to return to Egypt but before divine intervention becomes visible. Moses and Aaron respond to pure human rebellion without yet knowing how God is going to address the crisis, making their prostrate position an act of faith as well as an emotional expression. As Dennis Cole says, Moses and Aaron's prostrate response to Israel's rebellion reveals the heartbreaking reality that spiritual leadership often involves grieving over the very people you're called to serve, interceding for those who reject the divine promises you know to be true. Joshua and Caleb provide a minority report. According to them, why should Israel proceed? Why is their perspective so different? Joshua and Caleb's minority report provides a dramatically different assessment based on faith in divine promises rather than fear of human obstacles, demonstrating how spiritual perspective transforms the evaluation of identical circumstances. Their report begins with the same acknowledgement of the land's goodness. The land we passed through and explored is exceedingly good. Their theological foundation centers on divine approval and promise. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. Their assessment of the military situation directly contradicts the majority report. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land, because we will devour them. Their protection is gone, but the Lord is with us. Do not be afraid of them. See, Caleb and Joshua's perspective is different, and it stems from several crucial factors. First, their spiritual maturity enabled them to prioritize divine promises over human obstacles. While the other spies focused on military challenges, these two maintained a covenant perspective that recognized God's power is superior to human strength. Their faith was grounded in previous divine demonstrations of power rather than current appearances of difficulty. Second, their theological understanding of divine presence provided confidence. The Lord is with us. This awareness of divine presence transformed their evaluation of military odds from impossible to inevitable. Since divine assistance guaranteed victory regardless of the human military analysis, their perspective reflected understanding that the battle belonged to the Lord rather than to Israel's military capability. Third, their assessment of Canaanite vulnerability. Their protection is gone, their shadow has departed from them, suggests that they recognized God's judgment on Canaanite nations rather than merely evaluating human military strength. When they say their shadow or their protection is gone, that can refer to divine protection, suggesting that Caleb and Joshua understood that God had withdrawn his protection from the Canaanites, making conquest not only possible, but certain. And fourth, their covenant perspective enabled them to see the situation through divine rather than human eyes. While the majority focused on present difficulties, Joshua and Caleb maintained eternal perspective that prioritized God's promises over temporary obstacles. Their report reflects understanding that God's faithfulness makes conquest inevitable, not just possible. The contrast between the majority and minority reports illustrates how spiritual maturity affects perception of identical circumstances. Both groups saw the same fortified cities, the same giant inhabitants, the same military challenges, and yet they reached opposite conclusions based on whether they prioritized God's promises or human obstacles in their analysis. Their courage to present a minority opinion, despite knowing that it would be unpopular, demonstrates the integrity that characterizes genuine spiritual leadership. They were willing to stand alone rather than compromise truth for social acceptance, revealing that faithful witness sometimes requires opposing popular opinion when it conflicts with divine truth. I just finished reading a biography of James A. Garfield, our 20th president, who was felled by an assassin's bullet only 3 months into his term, dying a couple of months later. The biography is entitled Destiny of the Republic, and I'd encourage you to read it. In that volume, James Garfield, when running for president, is talking to Frederick Douglass, himself a freed slave. And as he talked to Douglass, as he's running for president and espousing an anti-slavery platform that was very unpopular in 1880, he said this, "I would rather lose with you than win without you." That's Caleb and Joshua's perspective. They trust God, and they'd rather go with God, regardless of the uncertainty, than with the people back to the land of slavery and bondage. Joshua and Caleb's Minority Report demonstrates that faith transforms perception by enabling believers to see divine possibilities where unbelief sees only human impossibilities, making covenant promises more real than present obstacles. As Moses, Aaron, Caleb, and Joshua face death by stoning, God steps in furious. How is the nation's unwillingness to follow Moses a personal affront to God? Notice the text. The whole assembly talked about stoning them. Then the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting to the Israelites. The Lord said to Moses, "How long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me in spite of all the signs I have performed among them?" The people's unwillingness to follow Moses constitutes a direct rejection of divine authority and character, because Moses is God's appointed representative, and that makes rebellion against Moses equivalent to rebellion against God himself. So when God intervenes and is furious, that demonstrates that Israel's rebellion represents a personal affront to his divine character and authority. Rejecting Moses' leadership constitutes rejecting God, rejecting the divine calling and purpose of Moses. The Hebrew understanding of agency means that rejecting a representative is the same as rejecting the one who sent him. So when Israel rejects Moses, that represents a fundamental lack of faith in God's character and promises. It's not just merely a political disagreement with human leadership. The verb believe or trust, when God says, "How long will they refuse to believe in me?" That word believe means trust, and it indicates a covenant relationship based on confidence in divine reliability and faithfulness. How long will they refuse to trust me, he's asking. God refers to all the signs I performed among them, emphasizing that Israel's rebellion contradicts the overwhelming evidence of divine power and faithfulness. When they reject Moses, they reject God, and they reject God's wisdom in selecting their leader. Their desire to return to Egypt or choose alternative leadership challenges God's prerogative in guiding his covenant people. The timing of their rebellion makes the affront particularly grievous. This occurs after 2 years of consistent divine provision, protection, and guidance through Moses' leadership. Their rebellion at the threshold of the Promised Land demonstrates ingratitude that ignores sustained divine faithfulness in favor of momentary fear and uncertainty. The representative principle also means that violence against Moses, Aaron, Joshua, and Caleb represents violence against God's purposes and calling. The mob's willingness to stone these faithful servants reveals the depth of their rebellion against divine authority expressed through human leadership. As Tim Ashley says, Israel's rejection of Moses constitutes personal affront to God because divine authority operates through chosen human representatives, making rebellion against faithful leadership equivalent to rebellion against the divine character and purposes they represent. The idea that God gets angry makes many Christians uncomfortable. How do you respond to this account of God's anger? Notice the text. The Lord said to Moses, "How long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me in spite of all the signs I performed among them?" Divine anger in this passage represents God's holy and righteous response to Israel's persistent, deliberate covenant betrayal. It's not an arbitrary emotional volatility. Understanding God's anger requires recognizing its moral foundation rather than treating it as an arbitrary divine emotion. God's anger in Numbers 14 responds to Israel's rejection of His goodness, their spurning of His divine promises, and their ingratitude for His sustained divine faithfulness. This anger serves justice rather than contradicting love. The theological principle is that love without anger at injustice would be indifference, not caring. Divine anger demonstrates that God cares deeply about covenant relationship and cannot remain neutral when that relationship is violated through persistent rebellion. In fact, that's the understanding of the Hebrew word chesed, which is the word translated covenant love or faithful love or loyalty. The idea of chesed includes both blessing for faithfulness and consequences for betrayal. Contemporary people are uncomfortable with the idea of divine anger, and that stems from misunderstanding God's anger. Somehow we have the idea that anger is necessarily sinful or destructive, and that's based on our human examples of uncontrolled emotion. But biblical divine anger differs fundamentally from human anger in several ways. First, it's always morally justified, and it's not self-serving. Second, it serves redemptive rather than merely punitive purposes. Third, it emerges from perfect knowledge rather than partial understanding. And fourth, it operates within divine patience rather than emotional impulse. The context of divine anger in Numbers 14 reveals its redemptive purpose. God's initial proposal to destroy Israel and start over with Moses in verse 12 creates the opportunity for Moses to intercede for Israel. That ultimately leads to forgiveness and modified judgment rather than total destruction. Divine anger serves to highlight the seriousness of sin while creating space for mercy to operate through intercession. The anthropomorphic language describing divine emotion should be understood as an accommodation to our human understanding rather than an indication that God experiences emotions exactly as we do. The biblical writers use human emotional categories to communicate divine responses to moral situations in ways that finite humans can comprehend. Divine anger represents God's holy opposition to sin expressed in terms we can understand. The eschatological dimension of divine anger provides hope rather than merely threat. Biblical divine anger is temporary and it serves ultimate purposes of justice and restoration rather than perpetual condemnation. In fact, back in Exodus 34, verse 6, when God revealed his nature to Moses, one of the things he said is he's slow to anger, indicating that divine patience precedes divine anger, and divine mercy follows divine judgment for those who repent. The moral necessity of divine anger becomes clear when we consider the alternatives. A God who never became angry at injustice, oppression, genocide, or covenant betrayal would be morally indifferent rather than perfectly loving. Divine anger at sin demonstrates divine commitment to justice and righteousness that protects the innocent and holds the guilty accountable. The personal dimension of divine anger in this passage, how long will these people treat me with contempt, reveals that covenant relationship involves genuine interaction rather than merely legal obligation. Divine anger emerges from violated relationship rather than broken rules, demonstrating that sin hurts God as well as harming the sinner and others. The ultimate purpose of divine anger involves restoration rather than destruction. Even in Numbers 14, divine anger leads to discipline that serves educational rather than merely punitive purposes. The 40 years in the wilderness provide opportunity for spiritual growth and character development that prepare the next generation for successful conquest of the Promised Land. As Walter Brueggemann said, divine anger represents holy love's necessary response to sin and injustice, demonstrating that a God who never became angry at covenant betrayal and human suffering would be morally indifferent rather than perfectly loving. Why do you think Moses, who was also angry with the Israelites, asks God to forgive them? Upon what basis does Moses appeal for mercy? Well, Moses' motivation for intercession stems from several factors beyond just his leadership responsibility. First, there's his covenant understanding. He recognizes that destroying Israel would violate the divine promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob about their descendants possessing the promised land. Divine faithfulness to previous generations creates obligation that transcends the current generation's unfaithfulness. Second, Moses' relationship with God creates concern for God's divine reputation and character, rather than merely personal or national interests. His argument prioritizes divine honor over personal vindication, demonstrating mature spiritual leadership that seeks God's glory rather than human recognition or even revenge against difficult people. Third, Moses' experience of divine grace in his own life motivates mercy toward others. Think about his previous failures, killing the Egyptian, his reluctance to accept the divine calling, the anger that led him to strike the rock. All of these things met with God's divine patience and forgiveness rather than judgment. This personal experience of grace motivates the extension of grace to others despite their failure. And fourth, Moses' understanding of his mediatorial role between God and Israel creates a responsibility for intercession rather than just leadership. The concept of the kinsman redeemer, the Hebrew word is goel, includes advocating for those who are unable to help themselves. Moses accepts this responsibility for Israel in spite of their rebellion. As Jacob Milgram says in his JPS Torah commentary, Moses' intercession for rebellious Israel demonstrates that mature spiritual leadership transcends personal anger to advocate for divine mercy based on divine character rather than human merit, prioritizing covenant relationship over personal vindication. How is God's decision to bar an entire generation from entering the land an expression of both judgment and mercy? Notice the text. The Lord replied, I have forgiven them as you asked. Nevertheless, as surely as I live, and as surely as the glory of the Lord fills the whole earth, not one of those who saw my glory and the signs I performed in Egypt and the wilderness, but who disobeyed me and tested me 10 times, not one of them will ever see the land I promised on oath to their ancestors. No one who has treated me with contempt will ever see it. God's decision to exclude the wilderness generation from the promised land while preserving the nation itself demonstrates divine justice that punishes covenant breaking while maintaining covenant faithfulness to future generations, revealing how divine discipline can serve both corrective and protective purposes simultaneously. Divine forgiveness operates within justice rather than eliminating consequences. The judgment aspect appears in the exclusion of the generation that had witnessed the extraordinary divine revelation, and yet who had responded with persistent rebellion. He says, they tested me 10 times. That indicates completeness, not a precise number, suggesting that this generation had exhausted divine patience through repeated covenant violations, culminating in the ultimate rejection of divine promises. The justice of this judgment stems from their privileged position as witnesses to unprecedented divine revelation. They saw my glory, they saw my signs, emphasizing that this generation possessed unique evidence of divine power and character through the plagues in Egypt, the Red Sea crossing, the revelation of God at Mount Sinai, the ongoing provision in the wilderness. Their rebellion, therefore, represents informed rejection rather than ignorant mistake. The mercy aspect appears in several dimensions of divine response. First, God preserves the nation itself rather than destroying it completely, honoring his covenant promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob despite the current generation's unfaithfulness. The continuation of Israel through their children demonstrates divine commitment to covenant purposes that transcend individual generation failures. Second, the 40-year delay provides opportunity for spiritual formation of the next generation without the corrupting influence of those whose hearts had been hardened by persistent rebellion. The Hebrew understanding of education includes moral and spiritual development that requires proper environment and modeling. Removing the rebellious generation creates space for faithful development of their children. Third, the preservation of life during the wilderness period demonstrates mercy within judgment. Rather than immediate death, the excluded generation experiences divine provision and protection for the remainder of their natural lives. The judgment affects their inheritance rather than their survival, showing divine grace even within divine discipline. And fourth, the exceptions of Joshua and Caleb, implied though not explicitly stated until later, demonstrates that divine judgment distinguishes between individual faithfulness and corporate rebellion. Their eventual entrance into the Promised Land proves that divine justice operates with precision rather than blanket condemnation. The educational purpose of the 40-year period serves both judgment and mercy. For the excluded generation, it provides time for repentance and spiritual growth, even though they cannot inherit the Promised Land. For the next generation, it creates formative experiences that develop faith, obedience, and covenant understanding necessary for a successful conquest and settlement. The theological principle involves understanding that divine discipline serves redemptive rather than merely punitive purposes. The wilderness period becomes a classroom where divine character, law, and covenant relationships are learned through experience rather than just instruction. The tabernacle, the sacrificial system, the civil law, all developed during this period, creating a foundation for successful national life in the Promised Land. The mercy within judgment also appears in the gradual rather than the immediate implementation of exclusion. The text suggests that the excluded generation dies natural deaths over the 40-year period rather than experiencing sudden divine judgment. This demonstrates divine patience even within divine discipline. The contrast between divine forgiveness in verse 20 and divine judgment in verses 21 to 23 illustrates the complexity of divine grace that removes guilt while maintaining natural consequences of sinful choices. Forgiveness restores relationship, but does not eliminate all the results of covenant breaking, teaching both divine mercy and divine justice. As Dennis Cole says, God's exclusion of the wilderness generation from the Promised Land demonstrates how divine mercy and justice unite in discipline that punishes covenant breaking while preserving covenant purposes for future generations who can learn from their predecessors' failures. What did God say about Caleb? Because my servant Caleb has a different spirit and follows me wholeheartedly, I will bring him into the land he went into, and his descendants will inherit it. God's declaration about Caleb provides a striking contrast to the judgment pronounced upon the rebellious generation, highlighting how individual faithfulness receives divine recognition and reward even in the context of corporate failure and judgment. Caleb possessed spiritual perspective and motivation that distinguished him from the majority of his generation. This different spirit enabled him to see divine possibilities where others saw only human obstacles. Caleb held nothing back in his loyalty to God, contrasting with Israel's divided heart that longed for Egypt while claiming to follow divine guidance. God's promise regarding Caleb's reward directly contradicts the judgment upon his generation. The theological significance of God's declaration about Caleb establishes several crucial principles. First, Individual faithfulness receives divine recognition even within the context of corporate rebellion and judgment. Caleb's minority position did not disqualify him from divine blessing, but rather distinguished him as being worthy of special honor. His willingness to stand with Joshua against popular opinion demonstrated courage that divine justice acknowledges and rewards. Second, the different spirit that characterized Caleb suggests that spiritual perspective rather than natural ability determines response to divine promises and challenges. Caleb saw the same fortified cities and giant inhabitants as the other spies, but he interpreted them through faith rather than fear, divine promises rather than human limitations. This spiritual discernment enabled faithful witness despite unpopular consequences. Third, wholehearted commitment to divine purposes created distinction between partial and complete discipleship. The Hebrew concept of whole or complete indicates integrity, where public profession matches private conviction, and consistent behavior demonstrates authentic spiritual commitment. Caleb's wholehearted following contrasts with Israel's divided loyalty. Fourth, divine rewards often extend beyond individual recipients to include their descendants, demonstrating how faithfulness creates a blessing that transcends personal experience to benefit future generations. Caleb's inheritance includes both personal fulfillment and family legacy that multiplies the impact of his faithfulness. The timing of God's declaration about Caleb provides encouragement during judgment, showing that divine justice operates with precision rather than blanket condemnation. While corporate rebellion brings corporate judgment, individual faithfulness receives individual recognition that preserves hope for future restoration and blessing. Caleb's example also demonstrates that minority faithfulness can maintain divine purposes even when majority opinion opposes divine will. His willingness to stand with Joshua against the entire congregation illustrates courage that enables divine work to continue despite human opposition and unbelief. When God describes Caleb as my servant, he places him in the company with other biblical figures like Abraham, Moses, David, and the suffering servant of Isaiah, indicating that servanthood represents honor rather than merely functional relationship. Divine service creates intimacy and purpose that transcends ordinary human experience. As Gordon Wenham says, God's commendation of Caleb demonstrates that individual faithfulness receives divine recognition and reward, even within contexts of corporate rebellion, proving that wholehearted commitment to divine purposes distinguishes true servants regardless of popular opinion or majority practice. How would spending 40 years in the desert under the leadership of Moses address the Israelites' lack of faith in the Lord? This time our text comes from the New Living Translation. Now turn around and don't go on toward the land where the Amalekites and Canaanites live. Tomorrow you must set out for the wilderness in the direction of the Red Sea. The 40-year wilderness period serves as divine curriculum designed to develop faith through extended experience of divine faithfulness, provision, and character formation that would prepare the next generation for successful conquest and settlement of the Promised Land. The wilderness becomes a classroom rather than merely punishment, a place of formation rather than simple exile. The extended time frame of 40 years allows for their faith to develop through sustained experience of divine reliability that short-term encounters cannot provide. There's the daily provision of manna. There's water from the rocks. There's the preservation of their clothing and sandals that never deteriorate. There's protection from their enemies, guidance through the cloud and the fire. All of these things create a comprehensive evidence of God's divine care that accumulates over time to build an unshakable confidence in the divine character and promises. The desert offers no natural resources for them to be sustained, no security. It forces them to completely depend upon God. This environment creates conditions where faith becomes a practical necessity rather than merely a theoretical concept. Moses continues to lead them during the 40 years, providing stability and spiritual guidance. The tabernacles erected, the tabernacle worship, the sacrificial system, the civil law, all provide a practical framework for living under the covenant. The rebellious generation dies during the 40 years, removing their corrupting influence that had undermined faith and obedience. The faith of the people is tested through various challenges. No water at Meribah, the bronze serpent, the Korah's rebellion, conflicts with surrounding nations. All of these provide opportunities for growth that build spiritual strength and demonstrate God's divine faithfulness under pressure. Each crisis becomes a learning experience that develops confidence in divine solutions to human problems. As Dennis Olson says, the 40-year wilderness period transforms punishment into pedagogy, using extended divine faithfulness to develop unshakable faith in a generation that learns divine character through daily experience rather than inherited tradition. Well, that's our brief look at rebellion, trusting God against all odds in Numbers chapter 14. In our next lesson, we'll look at striking the rock, the temptations of leadership in Numbers 20. I hope you'll join us. In the meantime, may the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace as you trust in Him, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.